And I think that bigger picture is revealed in the institutional framework for world government, which is being set up all around us and is already so deeply underway that most people would be shocked if they really started to take a look into it. And that institutional framework is, of course, brought in through the governmental organizations, the international governmental organizations that are governmental in all but name, from the IMF to the UN to the World Trade Organization. And it's represented in things like that story about the TSA with the genetic screening and the genetic pat-downs. That, of course, relates back to the newborn babies getting their blood taken at birth for DNA databases, going into a Pentagon DNA database that Alex Jones has been talking about for 15 years, and the mainstream media is finally catching up to let people know about it. And they're a perfect example of a system that's being instituted across the world at the exact same time in country after country, and it's being done by secret agreement, handshakes done behind closed doors that the public never sees about, never hears about, and doesn't learn about until 30 years after it's already started.
Yeah, that's right. It's a coordinated continuity of agenda that was planned long ago, implemented from the top at the United Nations global level, and implemented in the various countries. And it's very interesting to me that with the worldwide economic crisis, which was caused through globalism, through all these countries being sinewered together as if they were under the fascist emblem, and how this has spread. Now we have the price of food is at the heart of the wave of these revolutions. How will they use the economic crisis to cause further crisis? More on that when we get back with James Corbett. I'm Aaron Dykes. This is Infowars.com. We are back on this Monday, February 28, 2011 broadcast. I'm Aaron Dykes, filling in for Alex Jones. He should be coming on at the end of this segment. We have James Corbett of the Corbett Report for one more segment. A couple odds and ends here. I just want to mention that the last World War I veteran has died. Frank Buckles, the last U.S. World War I veteran, has died. A spokesman for the family said Sunday. He was 110. Definitely a milestone, the last survivor of that globalist contrived war, which has led us into the paradigm of global government for the 20th and 21st century. Not only do we have protests throughout the Middle East, we have China uses whistles, water, and police on protesters. That's in the AP. We have Madoff, Bernie Madoff, tells New York Magazine government itself is a Ponzi scheme. And that brings us into how the globalists have used this economic crisis to fuel greater revolutions throughout the region that will only come back around on the U.S. and other Western nations, including the price of food and the price of oil. James Corbett, what are your takes on how they've used our worldwide economic crisis to fuel greater events?
Well, not just how they've used it, but how they've constructed it exactly. You can look back, of course, at the repealing of Glass-Steagall and how that created the derivatives bubble, which unfortunately now is just a mind-boggling number, whatever it is, however many quadrillion it is at this point. It's more than all of the assets in the world combined. So they have this giant derivatives bubble of totally imaginary wealth that they've created out of nothing, which is now set to pop and deflate and be the final straw that breaks the back of the world economy. And again, this is something that has been envisioned and thought about for a long time. And again, I would direct people back to Carol Quigley and writing about how the secret agreements reached with the Bank of International Settlements and its various arms, the central bank of central banks, as it's referred to, and how it, through a series of secret agreements, will come to dominate the world system, a complete one world system of economic control. And of course, now we see it during the economic destabilization, the IMF coming up and saying, oh, hey, well, we've got the world currency that can bring stability back to the destabilized world order. We can provide a new world order of a new world currency, exactly as people have been talking about in the alternative media for decades, and as unfortunately reality is just catching up to.
Yeah, and it's a real shame. There's really no doubt that they are building China to be the next global government engine as the U.S. winds down at the expense of the U.S., as the U.S. will be broken by these energy crises, as they absorb all the remaining independent forces of economic, as they take over everything. It's just really frightening. Your thoughts, Corbett?
Well, I agree with that assessment. It's unfortunate, but it's true. It's an analogy that I've heard before, that it's kind of like the elite globalists are these parasites that'll go and lay their eggs inside of a country and hatch and infest that country and use it as an engine for itself to go out and spread and propagate. And then once that host is a carcass, is a shell, is starting to decay, they'll just break out and fly over to some other new host and invade that. And that seems to be exactly what's going on. America was the engine for the New World Order system to move the ball further down the field. And now that America is being taken down by design, the Chinese model is being brought in. And of course, we know the Chinese model is all about mobile forced abortion vans and complete control and harvesting the organs of prisoners and all of this, which surprisingly enough, they didn't talk about on Hu Jintao's recent state visit to America. No, they put up Chinese flags all down the in Washington, because he's just such a great, wonderful leader, just like Mao was, right?
But then going back to the Middle East, if this whole thing isn't globalist contrived, somebody sure propped up the dominoes in a very convenient fashion so that all this stuff would trigger itself to all come to the surface at the same time. Going back to Brzezinski and his plans for geopolitical domination of the grand chessboard, we have Tony Cartalucci wrote an article last week called The Path to Persia, which basically deals with a lot of the stuff Brzezinski has been planning for a couple of years. Brzezinski and Defense Secretary Robert Gates wrote a paper in, I believe, the latter part of 2007, 2008, really dealing with how Iran would most likely not see a direct military intervention, but really they would kind of circumvent through a secondary route, really a lot of it dealing with these kind of popular uprisings, and it just matches perfectly with this color revolution tactic, these so-called Twitter protests, and they are happening in Iran, and we know Iran is the key piece on that area in the on the chessboard, in terms of getting to that latter stage where China becomes superior and whatever happens to the U.S. happens. What do you think about the Brzezinski path to Persia?
Right. Well, it's important to understand that the Brzezinski method is not to attack your enemy directly, but to use the various pieces on the board to your advantage to get someone else to destabilize your enemy for you. And of course, that's exactly what the color revolutions are. And of course, there are all sorts of other underhanded ways in which war can be waged without being directly at war, and we see that, for example, with the Stuxnet worm that was created by American Israeli intelligence and used to destabilize the Iranian weapons program. So again, there's all sorts of things that are going on under the table and behind the scenes that are, of course, more important than what we're being fed through the palatable pap of the mainstream media.
And Stuxnet's a very interesting example because it's an admitted tool of war, albeit not directly violent. But the response to it is that we're supposed to have cybersecurity at home now, that they're going to clamp down on the internet and potentially curtail freedoms and direct access because of things like the Stuxnet, which we know are coming right out of foreign policy and the Defense Department. And as you mentioned, U.S.-Israeli intelligence. It's just amazing how they build one crisis upon another, and it's all set to react on this map. And the things happening in the Middle East are happening here at home, too, in whatever form. I don't know if it's going to be the way Farrakhan sees things, but it's already happening in Wisconsin and other parts.
It's so right, and it's so important for people to understand that these weapons that are being supposedly constructed to combat the enemies, which themselves are being propped up by the globalists, are always also directed at ourselves. I mean, that's the point of these types of crises and these types of weaponry and all the things that are being developed, is that whatever you see being used against your enemy, at some point, unfortunately, the globalist-controlled governments are going to try to use against themselves as well, because that's the way they construct these crises. So you see Stuxnet worm being used as a way to say, well, look, these types of things can be constructed, so now we have to create this overarching cybersecurity bill, which, oh, by the way, can let us have a kill switch over the internet. But it's bad when Egypt uses it. It's great if we have that option, though. So again, yes, absolutely. Every crisis is aimed outwards and inwards. It's like the TSA. Do they really need genetic screening of people coming into the country? No, they don't. But what is that about? It's about creating the genetic screening control grid based on these database technologies that, of course, is part of the eugenics program, which I know you're extremely well familiar with because I know some of the articles you've written about the eugenics agenda.
Yeah, the eugenics agenda seems to never end. It goes back more than a century, and we're just seeing neo-eugenics now. But, of course, that's a whole other topic. But, yeah, the DNA thing is very frightening at TSA, and we know it does fit into larger paradigms. Particularly to watch is Bill Gates Foundation and everything they're doing with these vaccines. But what else is on your radar right now, James Corbett? What else have you been reporting on recently?
Well, there's so much to report on, but even just touching on the Gates Foundation and the things they're doing with the vaccines and the way they're promoting this genetic screening technology and all of that, well, one way to look at that is through the paradigm of what the foundations are and how they came into existence and what they're really about. So I would urge people who have not done so to take a look at the work, the testimony of Norman Dodd. And G. Edward Griffin did such a landmark interview with him in the early 1980s that's now completely available for free viewing on the net, through YouTube or whatever. And people, unfortunately, it's a travesty that so few people have watched it, but just startling testimony from this man who was on the head researcher for a congressional committee in the 1950s called the Reese Committee, which was looking into the tax-exempt foundations of the robber barons, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Fords and the others, who had set up these foundations to use as an arm of control, even as they're hiding under the guise of philanthropy. And his testimony about what he found in the meeting minutes for the founding of the Carnegie Endowment in 1908, and what they were talking about and how they decided that the best way to manipulate society is to get America into a war. So then they started deliberating about what would be the best way to get America into a war. And then, of course, by 1917, they were involved in World War I. And again, it's just all part of this manipulation that's going on at a scale that few people would even begin to imagine unless they're really seeking out this information. But it is there and it is available, and people need to start using the tools that we have right now to arm themselves with the knowledge that we need to win.
Yeah, and it's amazing how deep this strategy does go. By the way, we have an interview exclusive for PrisonPlanet.tv with Charlotte Iserby, where she does talk about a lot of these Norman Dodd tax-free foundation hearings. But bottom line, our country's basically a farce. It was taken over long ago by these tax-exempt foundations, and it'd be bad enough if they were operating independently, but they are clearly coordinated with the United Nations, which the Rockefeller family themselves helped set up. Then they have their own foundation and the other foundations that seem to do the work for them. They come up with these strategies, and then they globally implement them in a coordinated fashion, top-down into these various countries. Particularly all throughout the West. You see things implemented in the U.S. at the same time as Britain, Australia, Canada, other parts of Europe, and we've been taken over by these foundations. What we think is our constitutional government has been completely thwarted, and until we as a larger nation wake up to that, we can't get our constitution back because we think things are still going along hunky-dory, problems here and there, but really we were sold out a long time ago. James?
Exactly right. So people can look into things like the ID card issue and how the UN has had their conferences and come up with protocols to standardize ID cards throughout numerous countries. So a couple of years ago, everyone in America was talking about the real ID and what a terrible travesty that would be to come in to create this national ID database that would be another part of the control grid. Well, it's already in place and functioning in numerous countries, and we have this standardized ID that is really an international ID database that's just waiting to be actualized. It's already the protocols are already set up, the standards are in place, and country after country is implementing it, again, quietly behind the scenes, international agreements that few people have any idea about, but there are researchers out there that are providing valuable information on that. And for example, I've talked to Nathan Allenby, a researcher in the UK, who wrote an excellent article about the way the ID cards are being brought in as an international on an international basis without people really understanding what this is really about.
Yeah, and look to Egypt. Not Egypt at all. Look to India, where they're implementing the biometric thumbprinting and the other DNA-based stuff. And then you've got Gandhi, his whole revolution started being against thumbprinting, being against biometric and ID cards way back, nearly 100 years ago. And yet this stuff is happening, and it's true. It's coordinated all the places you say. Anyway, we thank you for your time, James. We have Alex on the line, and we're going to go to him now. Really appreciate your insights as we try to figure out this Middle East and everything else that's going around the world. Thank you, James.
Thank you.